hay estudiantes de geografía, de otros centros, pero también tenemos aquí a nuestros urbanistas y arquitectos, así que esperamos pues que resulte de su interés. Hay estudiantes de... Bueno. Okay. Bien, pues para mí es un gusto y un honor tener por aquí a nuestra presentadora del día de hoy, la doctora Ayona Data. La profesora Data investiga las intersecciones entre el futuro urbano, la ciudadanía de género y las smart cities, centrándose en las nuevas configuraciones de las relaciones de poder de género en el área de los territorios digitales. Es decir, hay una combinación entre el tema de ciudad inteligente y los estudios de género. Su investigación se basa en el espíritu de la coproducción con comunidades de base que utilizan métodos de investigación digitales, cartográficos, visuales y participativos para desarrollar capacidades de género en los bordes de lo digital y lo urbano. Su trabajo ha sido insumo fundamental en políticas y conocimiento público, con lo que ha ganado reconocimiento internacional, lo que la ha llevado a ser conferencista invitada en la Conferencia de las Naciones Unidas sobre Comercio y Desarrollo, en el Consejo Económico y Social de las Naciones Unidas y en el programa Habitat también de las Naciones Unidas. Ha sido editora de la revista Urban Geography, la geografía urbana, desde 2017 y forma parte de los consejos editoriales de las revistas Antipode, Dialogues in Human Geography, Digital Geography and Society, que es una de las revistas más prestigiosas que existen en el ámbito de la planeación y el medio ambiente, y que por cierto tenemos en la biblioteca para que luego le echen un ojo. También recibió, y este es bastante reciente y es de gran mérito, la medalla Busk de la Royal Geography Society, en sociedad con el Instituto de Geógrafos Británicos en el 2019, por sus contribuciones a la comprensión de las Smart Cities a través del trabajo de campo. Y es actualmente profesora del University College en Londres. Y bueno, pues creo que somos afortunados de tenerlo, y pues para tenerla y para pues invitarla a que nos haga su presentación, les pediría un aplauso para ella.
Thank you, Juan, Professor Juan Demeritis. Thanks for the invitation to come here and do this lecture. I'm really honored and very fortunate to be in this fantastic campus and this beautiful building. I'm sorry I don't speak in Spanish. I hope next time to be better at Spanish. I'm still learning. So I'll try and speak slower in English, because I believe many of you are listening to the translation. And if at any time you feel I'm speaking too fast, please raise your hand and I'll go slow again. So thanks again, Juan, for your very generous introduction. I didn't understand much of it, but I can only assume from the length of it that it was very generous. Thank you so much. And as I said, please feel free to raise your hand at any time if you have any questions. So I'll start this presentation, which is kind of a culmination of my work for the past many years. I have been focusing on gender issues in cities and the built environment, particularly in the making of gendered cities and gendered spaces. And this is a more recent development where, with the onslaught of smart cities, it made us think, where does gender fit into this highly technological, technocratic management and administration of cities of the future? So the title is called Gendering the Smart City, and I want to talk from how we move from gendered spaces to regional features. So I'm going to start with this quote because it gives a context for what I'm talking about today. This is a quote from a newspaper article, and it's also the image of what was published in the newspaper article sometime in the 2014, 2015, when India was gearing up towards creating 100 smart cities across the country. So this is a pitch for the Delhi smart city. Delhi, as you know, is the capital of India's. And it was gearing up towards a particular kind of smart city that was responding to gender issues, particularly in the case of gender-based violence. I'm not sure if you all are aware of the very violent crimes against women that's been happening, very highly mediatized, and it's been very global. So Delhi's approach to addressing gender-based violence in the city has been a technological solution. And in this particular case, they have created a vast number of technological solutions that relate to increasing CCTV cameras, equipping police systems, creating a command and control center through which all the spaces in the cities can be seen and managed, community policing, etc., aerial surveillance. And I'm quoting here from the government of Delhi's guidelines, where it says, the goal of Delhi's Safe City program is to build a safe and inclusive city where women and girls are enabled to live a life free from sexual violence and from the fear and anticipation of such violence. Women and girls have a right to the city. The overall objective is to strive to eliminate violence against women and girls. So Delhi's answer to gender-based violence has been the smart, safe city. And of course, this has been kitted out by global IT corporations. All this technology doesn't come cheap. And it's become the wider narrative of how Delhi resolves the issue, the problem of GBV, gender-based violence. So I want to start with this. I wanted to start with this because our approach in this project was to begin by critiquing this technocratic solution to gender-based violence. The approach to resolving a social issue is being taken as a technological problem. And I'm quoting here from Virilio, the very well-known architect, who talks about how surveillance works, and surveillance works through this fear of violence. And he argues that we have reached a level of surveillance in which people themselves sign up for self-surveillance. He talks about the future popular self-governance of civil fear. He doesn't talk exactly about gender-based violence, but he talks about the civil fear which leads to self-governance. And you see that, of course, in the wider adoption of CCTV cameras, but also in the way that mobile phone apps particularly try to deal with gender-based violence. So there are safety apps which women are encouraged to download on their mobile phones in order to raise the alarm if something happens. And this is something what Pradeep Ninand Thomas has also argued as government 2.0. So government 2.0 is which means that the citizens are actively involved in their own self-surveillance, that citizens actually support the increasing surveillance of public and private spaces. And here Agnieszka Leszinski, who's also written a lot about platform urbanism, about smart cities, etc., talks specifically about how gender-based violence works through these apps and technological solutions. She argues that women's bodies willingly position themselves within and actively contribute to an urban security calculus as a means of minimizing their own personal exposure to urban risks presented by risky bodies in risky spaces. So a lot of women actually download these mobile phone apps, keep themselves under surveillance by these mobile phone apps in order to address the problem of violence that they may face in the cities. And this is, of course, Gurumurthy and Chami, who's also written about this technocratic solution to social problems. They talk about this as an ICT-mediated social order, that ICT is now mediating every kind of social solution, social problems that we experience. So this is the point where I wanted to introduce the Gendering the Smart City project. It was funded by Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK. And this is just a list of all the people we worked with. This was a project in which we were really interested in seeing how women themselves use technology. And what does it mean to live with violence for 24/7, but also when these technologies, the smart, safe city technologies, are not available to you. And so the project was an action research project, which I'll talk about in a minute. But we also thought that we will work on this project from the periphery. The reason why we looked at the periphery was because it is the periphery and it's in the working classes that the smart technologies do not reach. So while there has been an approach to dealing with gender-based violence, at the same time, the technocratic solutions to gender-based violence are only limited to the city center. So if you're living in the peripheries, if you're working class women, you don't have a mobile phone, you're really left out of these technological solutions. So what we were interested in looking at the periphery of Delhi. So this is a map of Delhi. But we were also interested in looking at some of the kind of completely excluded communities. This is a map of Delhi which shows the slum settlements which happen, and I'm guessing most of you know what slums are, that kind of ad hoc encroachment of public land that happened with the rural migrants when they came to the city. So the purple dots in the city are where the slum encroachments had happened from the 1940s, 50s, 1960s. In the 2000s, when Delhi decided to host the Commonwealth Games, it went into a huge mass slum eviction program. It had done some slum evictions before as well, but this was a mass slum eviction program, the most recent one. And those purple dots where the slums were located were evicted and pushed to the peripheries of the city where you see the red squares. And we were interested in these, I don't know if I can use the laser pointer. Is there a laser pointer here? Probably. I'm scared to do anything without. Is that one? Ah, great, thanks. So we were interested in looking at the periphery of the city. And this is at that time really sort of empty land. There really was nothing, but the state of Delhi government, the municipality and the slum development wing removed the people who were located here to these red squares. And we were looking at this particular settlement called Madanpur Khadar, which was in the periphery, but also distance-wise, it's quite close to the commercial and office area, which is Nehru Place. So we were looking at Madanpur Khadar, and most of them were also relocated from these areas to Madanpur Khadar. We were looking at the periphery as a space of urbanization where the city expands, but it expands by throwing out its unwanted citizens to outside its metropolitan boundaries, but it's also the space where people are largely excluded from all sorts of urban basic services, and now including they're excluded from the digital and information infrastructures. So this is Madanpur Khadar. This is just a couple of photos that it shows what it looks like. To the outsider, it looks like a slum, but it's actually not a slum because they hold titles to the land. They were legally relocated here, but relocated with just the plots with absolutely nothing there. So they have built their houses over generations. So it's a second generation which lives there now. The young women that we were working with, they were very young or not even born at the time in the 2000s when they were relocated. So they really have only memories or oral narratives from their parents about how difficult it was coming here. And their parents were really pioneers because they built these houses, they got water connection, public toilets built, they got electricity, et cetera, et cetera. So this is in Delhi's metropolitan periphery. And what they have engaged in over 2 generations is peripheral urbanization. But that peripheral urbanization has also pushed them into a different kind of periphery. This is again a view from above, and we went up on one of these houses and took a photo of the main street that leads into Madanpur Khadar. So I argue here that, excuse me, Madanpur Khadar and other spaces like it in the peripheries are also part of Delhi's informational periphery. What does that mean? It means that we can no longer look at peripheries as just purely material, geographical exclusion, or even social exclusion.
it is also a form of informational exclusion, because even though they have now, they've got water connections, they have some level of sewage and sanitation, they have electricity, they are really still not very well connected by digital information, digital infrastructures. Network availability is very low. Data is very expensive because they are not very well to do, so they have to buy data in order to access the internet. And often there are power cuts. So if there's a power cut, you can't charge your mobile phone, so you get left out. And then you have the added problem of the capacity, digital capacity and digital literacy. So even though there are various apps and various services that you can access on the internet, many of these women are not able to access this. Many of these women do not even know that these welfare benefits exist for them. So they're really left in an informational periphery because of the political, technological intersections. And I argue that this exclusion to the information periphery is a political, technological tool of the state in ways that generations are kept permanently excluded from the city at large. So the way we approached this problem was to look at not an Internet of Things. And the Internet of Things, IoT, is a very popular word that is given to us by the smart city technology companies, and a variety of ways that new smart cities and new technologies are approaching the cities of the future. But I argue, following Willems's logic, that we need to look at the politics of things. And here the thing I mean is the mobile phone, because really the women have only the mobile phone in order to reach and access the city and identify themselves as part of the city. And Willems argues that we need to look at the politics of things because of the ways in which things, objects, infrastructures, and physical space remain crucial to political communication in a digital age, as well as the manner in which bodies, objects, and urban space become politicized and digitally remediated. And here I argue that women's bodies are key to understanding how they remain outside, how they remain in the informational periphery, and how the mobile phone can become a political technological tool from below to speak back and to push back against the smart city technologies of the state that come from above. So this was our action research project. We were doing research, but we were also trying to provide some pathways in order to push back against this kind of smart technology influx, kind of the deluge of smart technologies from above, which don't really reach these women. So we proposed a feminist toolkit, and I'm just going to talk really quickly about 4 pathways that we co-produced with the women that we were working with in Madanpur Khadar. What's a toolkit? In this context, a toolkit is a collection of authoritative and adaptable resources that enables the intended user to learn about an issue and identify approaches for addressing them. So it's not a formula, it's just a pathway, it's very contextual, and it might not work in other contexts, but in this context, it worked for us. It's a digital, visual, and participatory approach that we took. And we took 4 pathways, which I'm going to talk about in the next few slides. The first one is to curate local histories. Second one is to create safe spaces online. Third one is to produce and perform spoken word. And the fourth one is enriching voices with stories, stories with voices. And it'll be clear what I mean by that in the next few slides. So the first one was this, trying to address the informational periphery in the sense that there is absolutely no information about these resettlement colonies anywhere on digital space. And actually, if you typed in Madanpur Khadar, the name of their colony, what you would get is a few media articles about crime and violence and murders and things like that. If you went to the municipality or the slum department, you would probably get a plan of the neighborhood as it was allocated in the 2000s. So we decided it was very important to occupy digital space and therefore to document the local histories of how this colony came into being. And we thought we would do it with a Wikipedia editathon because all these women had mobile phones. And so we brought them together in this space and we asked them to log into Wikipedia, register, and start writing together about the history of this neighborhood. And we faced the first challenge. The first challenge was these women really did not understand how browsers worked. They had been so confined into these closed spaces of apps. There's an app for everything. There's a Google Map app. There's a Google app. There is a Facebook app. There is a Twitter app. So they kept asking us, where's the app? And we said, no, you go into the browser and type in Wikipedia. So we realized there was a problem with digital capacity. The second problem we had was network. The network was very poor. Even if they managed to register, they just could not sustain an editathon in Wikipedia space. And then, so we decided we will go analog. So we use these Post-it notes, and we asked these women to write down the oral history of these places, stick them on the board like you see in the picture. And then we collated these Post-it notes, and we translated, and we put it up on the Wikipedia page. So this actually still exists. I think it's been, other people have added things to it, but it still exists. But when we actually put it up, we faced our next challenge, which was that we got a notice from Wikipedia saying this page is going to be taken down because it has no authentic sources. And all we could conclude from that is in digital space, oral narratives have no value, because this was all oral narratives. There is no reference. There is no official reference to Madanpur Khadar other than those media articles about violence. So what we did is, again, us as scholars, we put references to our books, our articles on slums and resettlement colonies and gender-based violence, and then it got accepted. But it just showed to us how difficult it is to occupy informational space, even the space of Wikipedia, which is supposed to be open and flexible for anyone to contribute to and anyone to occupy. Oral narratives are really, really hard to validate and legitimize. And in this context, with working classes in peripheries, oral narratives is all you have. The second one, which continued from the start, was to create safe spaces online. And this was through a WhatsApp closed group that we had created right at the start. And we created this because in the absence of safe spaces, physical safe spaces, it was very important that there was a space in which they could express themselves and communicate with each other quite openly. Because sometimes the house where they lived in with their family was the most violent and the most unsafe space for them. So it was important that they had a space in which they could create conversations and have moments of solidarity and sharing and all of that. And then they also created diaries that would talk about the challenges with water, sanitation every day. They would talk about either the monsoon rains in which roads were flooded and they couldn't get to work and so on. And as you can see, it was a variety of different kinds of things. There were discussions, there were emojis, there were voice notes, there were pictures, videos. But what was quite prevalent was selfies. We were inundated by selfies every time they went out together, or they talked to each other when they dressed up. And we all do selfies, but there was something going on here which we were concerned about, that there was something that we were really missing. So we asked them, what is this selfies? Why do you have so many selfies? And my phone would be flooded with selfies every day. And they would say, well, it's because when we dress up, when we go to the city, then we take a selfie. And it's important, therefore, to note that selfies were a form of visual expression, a visual claiming of space in the city. And it's really this front-facing camera and the city at arm's length where they would put themselves and have the city in their background to kind of mark their space, that they were legitimate citizens of Delhi. And I quote here from Nunez, who also talks about selfies, that we shouldn't just reject them as something kind of narcissistic amongst the younger generation. She talks about selfies as this act of self-witnessing that serves as a form of parasocial civic engagement that attempts to communicate one's own space, one's own place within interpenetrating social spaces, no matter how gawking or disengaged they may appear at first analysis. And we realize that in the absence of any other kind of validation of their right to be urban citizens, they saw the selfies as a way to self-witness and document their right to be in these urban spaces. The third pathway was the spoken word. And this again continued in our WhatsApp group. And we realized as they were talking about different issues, they were writing in poetry. And we found this poetry really interesting and very fascinating, that the women were such good rhymers. They could rhyme so well and talk about the challenges that they faced so interestingly in satire. So in our workshops, when we had face-to-face workshops, we decided that we would actually write a rap song and actually perform this in a way to speak back against all sorts of challenges that they face in the city. And of course, they wrote pages and pages, and we had to work really hard with them to edit it down. We had a sound artist who worked with them then to record it. So they actually sang the rap song. And then we played the rap song to them. And then they said, well, where's the video? We want to be on YouTube. We want to be famous. And we had never thought that we would have to do a filming of the rap song. So then we found a community filmmaker who had worked with participatory methods, who then with us and with the young women worked for about a week to create this rap song. And I'm going to play this rap song in a minute, but I just wanted to say we had never thought that the rap song would receive so much attention. We thought this was for the women and for us to just sort of express the challenges that they were facing on a daily basis. But this rap song was then picked up by all the national newspapers, by the national TV channels, who then began interviewing these women, calling them into the studios, talking about gender-based violence. So it generated a momentum for conversation, which was citywide. And then within a year, National Geographic picked up this rap song and wrote a whole length piece on it. And then it went global and it went international. And these women have now become famous just for this one rap song. If you see in YouTube, there are a lot of views and a lot of comments about this, but I just wanted to play this to give you an idea. It looks not very polished, but you have to see it in the context that these women were doing something like this for the first time in their lives under great challenge. Some of them did not even tell their families that they were doing it till they actually finished the song and it was out on YouTube. So can you play the song, please? Oh, it's going. It's doing it.
बीच काफी ठोकरें खाई पर हमने भी हिम्मत दिखाई। नदी तो दूर नाली भी नहीं, पहाड़ तो दूर मुड़ के ढेर मिलेंगे, रास्ते में हो लाइट ना हो कोई फाइट। स्मार्ट शहर बस बहाना है, जनता को नीतियों के खेल में फंसाना है। सड़कों के अंधेरों में उभरते कदम मैं उठाती हूँ, कभी गार्ड कभी टैक्सी ड्राइवर बनके कदम से कदम मिलाती हूँ।
मैं हूँ लर्ट, मैं हूँ होशियार, मेरी हिम्मत है बेमिसाल। मेरे साथ कहो एक बार, ये शहर हमारा आपका
नहीं किसी के बाप का, शहर हमारा आपका नहीं किसी के बाप का।
शहर में लड़कियों की लाइफ काफी टफ है, अकेले रहना भी अलग ही भसाड़ है। यहाँ लड़कियों की कीमतों पे बोली लगती है, क्या हम इतनी भोली लगती है?
एक और से सुन लो, हम डरने वालों में से नहीं है।
क्या गलती है मेरी, रोज छेड़छाड़ केस होते हैं। क्या गलती है मेरी, दिल्ली में रोज 6 से ज्यादा रेप होते हैं।
क्यों समाज ने मुझको दबाया है, बिना खुद को सुधारे मुझे घर में बिठाया है।
निर्भया फूलंदे में बिल्किस या वो नन्ही सी लड़की, याद रहेगी उन सब की कहानी।
नए दिन हो गए हैं, आसमां में तारीख हो गए हैं, तारीख पे तारीख, इंसाफ की ड्यूटी से पुलिस भी है फारिग। मैं पंख फैलाना चाहती हूँ जिंदा दिल और बेखौफ, मैं खुलकर जीना चाहती हूँ, मैं खुलकर जीना चाहती हूँ। ओ दिल्ली जरा अपना दिल तो खोल, ओ दिल्ली जरा अपना दिल तो खोल। नारी शक्ति है अनमोल अनमोल, मन की बातें बहना तू भी बोल, तू भी बोल।
More power to you, sister. More power to you. More power to
Okay. Need to go to the next slide. Yes, great. So that was the video. And then we had COVID. Just right after all that had been done, we had COVID. And so the women were confined in their home, and we thought it was important then to reach out back to them and talk about what's going on and what are the new challenges they face. And we decided again, we will do it through a series of community podcasts. And it was really challenging because we couldn't meet face to face. It was also really challenging because in the context of COVID and job losses, the first thing that they cut out was charging their phone with data. So to have any kind of Zoom conversations, to have any kind of communication with them was also difficult. So we decided as part of the project to fund the data recharging and have a series of Zoom workshops in which we would train them to create podcasts and talk about the challenges that they'd been having during COVID. And it created really, this is a word bubble of the different conversations we had. And of course, what you see here coming out most often in the conversations was the challenge of time. The time was the biggest challenge in a way that they had very little time. Everyone is stuck at home. So the women landed up doing double shifts. They were cooking all the time for the men. They were cleaning all the time. And then they had to find time for their education, for their jobs, if they did that online. And so in a way, time was very restricted, but also they felt that time had stood still, that it was just not changing. Every day was the same. It had just stood still. And it was not moving, but it was standing still was the paradox of their COVID experience. And then you see problem coming up a lot and all sorts of problems. Problem with bus. Many of them couldn't actually work online because they're mainly in the service sector. So getting buses to get to work was a huge challenge during COVID lockdown, and various other things, Wi-Fi, and all sorts of things that I don't have the time to go into, but time was a critical thing. So from all these podcast training workshops, we created a series of 4 community podcasts in which the women interviewed people, mainly in their family, but also sometimes their parents, but sometimes their teachers, sometimes their friends, and created a series of 4 podcasts on 4 themes that was crucial to them during COVID. The first one was about time, and I'll play a short one about time. And again, in many of these, you see the emergence of poetry, which is fascinating with these women, how beautifully they wrote poetry about time, which I'll play in a minute. The second one was about marriage. And if you are women, you're not going out for education or work, the first thing the parents think about is, let's get you married. So most of them were talking about this challenge of resisting marriage or kind of negotiating, what kind of marriage they wanted to have, because that became a very important conversation during COVID lockdown. The third one was clothes. Because again, when they leave home, they can wear what they want and they go out. Parents don't really always find out. But when they're sitting at home, the surveillance around what clothes they wear became even stronger. So they were all talking about this in one podcast. And the fourth one, and actually one of the second important one, was about education, how to access education. Because when you have COVID lockdown, like I said, they don't have data. Even with the little amount of data that they have, the phone is usually given to the male members of the household for their education. So their brothers would use the phone for their Zoom classes, but the sisters would not have it. So education became a big challenge with the Zoom classes. I'm just going to play a very short clip from one of the podcasts, which sort of gives a sense of how they were thinking about time. It's an audio one because obviously it's a podcast, but you can read the text and you can see what, it's a very rough translation. It's not as good as the original poetry, but it's just a sense of what the podcast sounded like.
ये वक्त न जाने कितने रंग बदलता है, ये वक्त न जाने कितने रंग बदलता है, कभी गम तो कभी खुशियां हजार देता है, ये वक्त है कि गुजरता ही नहीं, जाने क्यों थम सा गया है। कल तक जो मासूम सी खुशी घर के आंगन को महकाती थी, न जाने कब जिम्मेदारियां उठाने लगी, वो छोड़कर साथ ख्वाहिशों के पन्नों का आंगन को दियों से सजाने लगी।
So I'm going to just read it out because obviously it's in Hindi and it's actually in Urdu, which you can't understand. So this poetry is about time. This time it changes countless colors. This time it changes countless colors, sometimes grief and sometimes thousands of joys it showers upon us. This is the time that does not pass. Who knows why it stands still? Until yesterday, the joyous innocence that scented the courtyard in our home have now unwittingly begun to bear responsibilities. She abandoned the pages of desires and began to bedeck the courtyard with lamps. She too had contemplated many desires of scaling great heights, dreams filled with countless responsibilities. Who knows why they keep changing? This time it changes countless colors, sometimes grief and sometimes thousands of joys it showers upon us. Today our hearts wait at the thresholds of hope. Someone will come with tidings of a new beginning. The wait is over for the eyes trained on the road. Time had arrived in the guise of a postman, but it delivered only an envelope of empty memories. But the heart still keeps believing that time, it changes countless colors, sometimes grief and sometimes thousands of joys it showers upon us. And there were lots of these sorts of small and long poetries that were embedded within the podcasts. And again, this was a way for them to speak back to the city and even to their own families in a way that they couldn't say face to face. The podcast they used to speak back about their own challenges and their experiences. So I want to sort of conclude here about these 4 pathways that we took in the action research in talking about what does this mean. This is a feminist, we call this a feminist digital toolkit. It was digital, it was visual, it was participatory. But we felt that in a way of using the phone as a politics of things, the women were also speaking back and occupying the informational periphery, occupying digital space in a way that they had not been able to do before. They had become authors of their own stories in their own voices, in a way, again, that they had not been able to before, because often their stories are told by others. It's told by people like us who are researchers. It's told by the state. It's told by policymakers. It's told by NGOs. Often women are not able to author in digital space, and that's what we were trying to do. So we present this toolkit as a pathway towards what Walter Mignolo has argued of epistemic disobedience, in refusing to be confined by the terms and conditions of technology from above, because it captures the politics of a decolonizing encounter in the margins of a digital age. So they really are in the margins, but what we feel is that it is a form of a decolonizing encounter. They're decolonizing the way that the mobile phone, the apps and technology has been used before. This toolkit has many limits, as I argued, in that it's also bound by the dynamics and constraints of infrastructures, gender power, and structural disadvantages. That's something we haven't talked about. I'd mentioned a little bit about the Wikipedia, but we had many such disadvantages all along. And we feel that the toolkit's decolonizing potential lies not only in exposing the structural and symbolic legacies of power through both the failures and slippages, but also in foregrounding a very polycentric way of rethinking the contours of colonization and decolonization of affective data across digital and analog spaces. So what we argue is happening is that the women have not produced statistical data, and often that's what's produced about these peripheral spaces. We give statistics, we give numbers, but what they produced is affective data, visual data, data about feelings, emotions, and that's how they were speaking back to both technology, to the state, and to their families. So what does this mean for the future? Where are we going from here? Doing this project and similar projects in the last 5 to 10 years has given us a sense that it's not just enough to do things from below. I think it's important to start from below because often people start from above, but I think we need to work from both sides. And so this is our new project in which Juan Demeritis is one of our collaborators. It's a new project in which we are really looking at the peripheries. We are really interested in what happens in the peripheries, both from above and from below, in the context of a digital information urban age. We are therefore, this project is called Regional Futures, because we are interested in the metropolitan region, not just at city centers, not just at specific slums or resettlement colonies, but really the metropolitan edge, the metropolitan periphery. And we're focusing on similar issues through 3 themes. One is really a very close scrutiny of the digitalizing state. And we're calling this the digitalizing and not the digitalized, because we feel that it's a process, but also it's always an aspiration. It's never complete. And the digitalizing state is really focused now on the dynamics of peripheral urbanization, of mapping the peripheries, on collecting more and more data and extracting more revenues and extracting more capital from the cartographies and the mapping of these peripheries. So on the one hand, we know that in the peripheries is where rapid urbanization is happening, but on the other hand, it's also important to see how the state uses this rapid urbanization through its own digitalization initiatives by mapping and making visible territories that were invisible to the state and to private investors before. The second theme we're looking at is the information infrastructures. That is how information travels, both from the state to the citizens, but also from the citizens upwards to the state. And finally, also within the state and the para-state, that is the private investors, the professionals, and so on. How does information travel? What are the infrastructures of travel of the information flows? And in particularly in the context of the peripheries, we are really interested in paper, the paper documents, paper information. Because in the onslaught and expansion of state into the peripheries, in the onslaught and expansion of private sector investment in the peripheries, it is the paper documents which is the only tool of resistance and pushback that the marginalized people might have in the peripheries. And what we're interested in is how paper and digital communicate with each other, or how information flows between paper and digital, or what are the blockades of information flow between paper and digital. And then finally, the third theme is territorial politics. And this is where we really want to look at the communities and what are the new and emergent spaces of citizenship. And perhaps we will have another toolkit to emerge from these new spaces. But really, what happens when peripheral urbanization is being facilitated through digitalization? What sorts of territorial politics emerge? How do citizens living in these peripheries react to this sort of expansion? And what sorts of new spaces of citizenship emerge as a result of this? These are our questions that we're asking. So we have two simultaneous processes that are the columns. So we're looking at one process of the digitalization and the other process of urbanization. And along the rows, you have the different themes: digitalizing state, information infrastructures, and territorial politics. I won't go into reading out the research questions, but that's what drives each of our investigations. And we have this project for the next 5 years. We're working closely with the University of Guadalajara and with Juan de Meritis. It's spread across 3 different continents, 3 different countries, 3 different metropolitan regions. One, of course, is the Guadalajara metropolitan region. The other is Nairobi metropolitan region. And the third is Mumbai metropolitan region. And we're looking at the peripheral municipalities in these 3 regions. And then finally, a plug for a new job opportunity here. We're looking for a postdoctoral researcher who will work with us for the next 3 years to do this investigation into regional features. Now I'll stop here. Thank you.
Muy bien, pues muchas gracias por esta presentación tan completa. Creo que con mucha sensibilidad se trataron pues una gran cantidad de temas muy interesantes, pues desde el tema del género en ciudades en la India, que no es muy diferente a lo que sucede con nosotros. No son temas distintos. Pues aquí me recuerda a al movimiento de las chicas chilenas, las tesis, por ejemplo, que traen también estas cosas. En fin, esa parte creo que nos debe de dar la ubicación en qué punto estamos en términos de género, tanto hombres como mujeres. Es otra cosa que la universidad está muy preocupada también. Pero otra cosa que es muy importante también es los métodos que están utilizando. Son métodos que utilizan precisamente las redes sociales, los medios electrónicos, que creo que hemos dejado un poco de lado y que valdría mucho la pena también desarrollar. El tema pues que hizo en la periferia creo que es muy interesante y pues da para pues incluso intentar algo similar. En fin, hay muchas cosas que quedan para la reflexión, pero que me gustaría conocer también pues cuál es la reacción de nuestros estudiantes y nuestros profesores ante pues esta temática que nos acaba de presentar Ayona. Entonces, pues abro la sesión para quien quiera hacer preguntas al respecto. Sí.
Sí. Buenas tardes. Carlos Flores, servidor. Sí, profesor de aquí del Centro Universitario. Primero, muchas gracias por la presentación. Excelente, muy buena investigación, muy interesante e importante. Y sí, cabría la situación de ampliarles el tema a los alumnos en el diseño arquitectónico y en el urbanístico, que se abra a estas situaciones de la ciudad inteligente, para que se tenga en consideración este tema tan importante en el futuro de nuestras ciudades, en la planeación urbana de nuestras ciudades. Y no nomás hasta las ciudades, sino irnos más a la micro, ¿sí? A una a un pequeño barrio, a una pequeña colonia, pero sí tener actualizado el tema de la ciudad inteligente en el diseño urbano y arquitectónico. Sería muy importante que se retomen estos temas en las prácticas de las aulas. Gracias.
Si quieren otra pregunta, otras dos más para que aproveche Ayona para la respuesta. Allá.
Hello, I'll speak in English. Okay. Jesse Mora, I'm a teacher here in the university. First of all, I want to congratulate you for your presentation. It was very complete, very interesting. Obviously, the violence for the woman, it's a worldwide problem. Here in Mexico, it's more than intense. It's been working on it, but obviously it needs a lot more than just political issues. I want to know, what is your view, more than just to see this problem as a woman problem, that I know that's just for that, it's very, very important to see it as a background problem, a culture problem, and an urban problem, the right to use their culture as a woman in the city, or their right not to use the city for their culture purposes. So I want to know more than just a woman issue, a culture issue, and a city issue. That's all. Thank you.
Gracias. Mayra Gamboa, también profesora de aquí del Centro Universitario. Yeah. Son dos preguntas. Bueno, muchas gracias por compartirnos estas experiencias. También algunos de nosotros estamos interesados en estos problemas y en visualizar también la problemática de las mujeres y su participación dentro de la ciudad. Y queríamos saber sobre, si puedes abordar un poquito más sobre las experiencias o los resultados, por ejemplo, con el programa de las mujeres utilizando estas apps, cómo se ha, pues no se ha mejorado la seguridad, si se están aplicando políticas en el gobierno, etcétera, o hacia dónde va. Y también este proyecto de Regional Futures, ¿por qué se está planeando como a 5 años? Es un horizonte un poco amplio cuando sabemos que los asentamientos informales o en las periferias también cambian muy rápidamente. Entonces, ¿cómo se está pensando estructurar para los resultados? ¿Cómo van a ir alimentando acciones o políticas, digamos, en estos 5 años? Gracias.
Yeah, thank you so much for all your questions and very, very important questions, actually. So I'll take them one at a time. Thank you for the first question. I see that more as an observation, but I do agree it's important to, in embed these sorts of issues within architecture training. I'm an architect by background, and I never had any training in talking about social issues in cities. And I remember when I was an architecture student and I wanted to do something with gender and space and power, I was asked by my teachers about how is this architecture? So I think a lot has changed now from our generation to this generation. And in the specifics of this project, I just wanted to highlight that we worked with the Delhi School of Architecture. And one of our workshops, we brought the urban design students to work with the women and walk around this neighborhood in order to think about small urban interventions in the neighborhood. And one of the things that the students found and proposed in their urban design project after that was that these neighborhoods are completely devoid of child-friendly spaces, not women-friendly, but child-friendly. So they actually did a whole urban design project in this neighborhood in terms of how to incorporate play areas, both for younger toddlers, but also teenagers, and even for young women in terms of vocational training, how to kind of recreate some of the spaces that is possible. So certainly I think it should be encouraged more, and we need to think more about this. But of course, design is not the only way. Design is only a very small thing. Ultimately, it depends on policies and politics and bureaucracy and, you know, maintenance of these spaces and so on. So that leads me to your question in terms of this is not just about women, and I absolutely agree. We were very aware that we are only focusing on the women when the problem is the men, and the problem is misogyny. But it's such a big problem, and we didn't have the time to deal with that problem. However, the NGO that we were working with, who actually helped us gain access and support and confidence of these women, they had been working there from the 2000s since their parents had been evicted. So they had been following their parents into the slums. So they had a lot of trust from the community. And in the past 10 years or so, they had been building a lot of workshops in which they were doing gender sensitization training with the young boys and men, particularly young boys and girls talking to each other in the workshop in terms of, you know, how I feel when you talk to me like that, you know, and how do the young boys understand the issues that their mothers or sisters are going through, particularly around menstruation, you know, because there's a lot of issues around, you know, the hard labor that women have to do, and, you know, how boys can help their mothers during that time. So they have done a lot of really important work in sensitizing. And so the women that we worked with actually had been part of those gender sensitization workshops. So in a way, the women you're seeing here are already kind of oriented towards claiming their rights and understanding how they are disadvantaged, although they don't really know how to address it. And this was one of the ways we showed them the pathways to address it. The second reason why we focused only on the women was because we felt that they didn't really have a safe space. So it was important to keep a group that was only women, and they would be able to share. Like I said, the WhatsApp group was very important because they just could not sit together in their house and talk about these issues with their parents or even sometimes their brothers. And we saw this when we were creating the rap song. We had so many boys coming in saying, look, I'm a great rapper, look, and they would like show us how well they rapped, and they were good. There were a couple of really good rappers in the community, but they're all men. So in a way, we also wanted to push back on this very gendered sound space, because rapping is big in India. It's like grime in America. It comes from these marginalized neighborhoods, but it's very, very gendered. It's all men. So in a way, we also wanted the women to become, you know, rappers in their own right. So we focused on the women. So there were these number of different things, and we felt it was important that we address that. And that leads to your other question in terms of politics and what happens after this. Yeah, I mean, there is politics does not walk the talk. Basically, there are several initiatives in India about educating girls and empowerment of women, and you know, and there's been over research and over influx of international communities. Like the UN Women is very present in most of these slums. There is an overinvestment from aid of aid into these communities for empowerment of women, but you're not seeing the changes as rapidly as you want to see. Perhaps it's a cultural problem, but also it's about policy and implementation. So if something happens and you go to the police, the first thing is the police would blame the victim. So those sorts of things maybe are universal globally as well, but I think there's a particular challenge that is faced by working class women that's not faced by middle class women in the city. Middle class women are more easily believed by the police. They have more social capital to take action, whereas working class women don't. And also the family resists them. So if something happens to you, then the family will stop you from going out. So they fear to talk about this with their families as well in case their mobility is restricted. So yeah, policy and implementation does not walk the talk, but I think things are changing and things are changing for the better. It's very slow changes. And in this project, we were not trying to shake the world. We saw small changes in each of these girls as success stories. So even if one of them were able to speak back to their family, and we saw that happen at the end, you know, we were shooting this along the main road, and one of their, you know, brothers came and started to take them inside and struggle. And she actually stood up and said, no, I won't go. And we were very worried. And she said, well, I'm going to be beaten up anyway. So I might as well do this and become famous and then get beaten up, then just go home and forget about this. So there is a resilience. There's a very strong resilience in them that is quite inspiring in that sense. But also in some of them, their families who resisted them doing this rap song, after it came on YouTube, one of the girls comes to me next day and she says, you know, my dad was actually sending the link to the family in the village. So they are able to convince their parents as well to some extent. And I could go on for you know, hours, but yes, for us, it was these small micro changes in the family that to us was success stories, and they have to build up. And the community podcast was the same. We saw a lot of changes happening. So the question about why 5 years? So the 5 years is not just this sort of a small scale project. This is a big scaling up project in which we are looking at all sorts of themes. And like I said, we want to really understand how digitalization works, and works sometimes to exclude, sometimes to include, sometimes to create and reinforce informational peripheries. So we really want to see how this kind of information infrastructure works, both for the state, for private sector, but also how it might work to include people who are left in the margins. So that's why 5 years, because you can't do this in a few months or even in 1 year. You need extended periods of time, extended observations. And the fact that the families move, yes, some people do move, but I think rental communities, they move a lot, but many of these people, at least in India, they've been there for generations and they want to be there. They just want things to improve. They want better quality sanitation, they want better water supply, you know, those kinds of things. They want better transport. So I think it's also possible to observe them over a period of time, and that's really, you know, what we are interested in. I don't know, Juan, if you want to say more about the regional futures thing.
Bueno, yo creo que es un proyecto que nos va a permitir conocer el estado de las cosas en temas de digitalización del territorio, temas de catastro, temas de pues, la propiedad en las zonas periféricas que son irregulares, que normalmente tienen que ver con ejidos y con comunidades indígenas. Entonces, pues creo que es un tema muy interesante. Y pues yo haría una invitación para pues estudiantes de licenciatura, de maestría, si están pensando en algún tema para su tesis o para un tema también de investigación en una de las clases, pues platicar con nosotros para ver cómo se pudiera también relacionar. Actualmente, para quien tuviera una maestría, existe la posibilidad de hacer un doctorado en University College Londres sobre este tema. Entonces, si conocen a alguien interesado para irse a hacer un doctorado de 3 años allá, pues hay una opción. Y luego también, para quien tenga un doctorado, hay una posición para estar trabajando durante 3 años acá. Entonces, bueno, creo que también trae beneficios este proyecto. que está financiado por la Comunidad Europea y que encabeza la doctora Data para esta comunidad estudiantil en general. Entonces están cordialmente invitados. ¿Alguien más quisiera hacer algún comentario? Enrique, allá atrás.
No sé si se escucha. Sí, soy Enrique García, soy profesor de la licenciatura en Urbanística y Medio Ambiente, soy geógrafo de profesión y bueno, precisamente me llama mucho la atención, hay asentamientos aquí en la periferia que no necesariamente son irregulares, son de fraccionamientos de casas de interés social, pero que tienen una problemática muy fuerte y bueno, con las mujeres y obviamente también con el de los hombres. Yo estoy haciendo actualmente mi tesis doctoral sobre la periferia urbana de dos fraccionamientos pues muy violentos en Tlajomulco, desde un enfoque de la ciencia posnormal, que precisamente trata un poco de esta ciencia para la gente y extraer pues de esas personas pues ese problema, esos resultados también. Y efectivamente parte de lo que he encontrado pues es que los fraccionamientos y sobre todo el diseño, yo estoy peleado pues con que no hay planeación en México y pese a todos los malos resultados que se dan y que se ha demostrado, por ejemplo, que el diseño, el modelo de ciudad disperso, difuso que sigue ahí, se sigue repitiendo y esto pese a todos los problemas que trae y más para las mujeres. En estos fraccionamientos existe una gran cantidad de madres solteras o jefas de familia y aún así pues poco resultado se da. El problema que me encuentro ahorita relacionado con el tema es que también no hay mucho acceso a estos esquemas de ciudad inteligente. Las personas, un gran porcentaje, no accede a las redes sociales. Entonces, en ese caso no sé cómo se trabajan. Igual en muchos fraccionamientos irregulares que no tienen la propiedad de su vivienda, pues yo creo andan en esa condición. Entonces no sé cómo se trabaje o se vaya a trabajar esta parte en su investigación.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. It's a very important question and it's a very important consideration for, I think, planners and architects. How do I begin? I think I would like to start by saying that the problem is not, the problem of gender-based violence is not, the most important problem is not of planning. The most important problem is of misogyny and societal norms that dictate women's bodies and spaces as somehow, inferior to men's. And I'm taking a very kind of binary approach. There's also questions of LGBTQ, transgender, which I haven't even touched upon. And we saw that in another project where transgender communities are even worse affected by COVID. But I think planning is an important consideration insofar as it restricts women's mobility. So in this particular case where the peripheries are so far away from the city, and particularly in the context of crisis of COVID and lockdown, it's so difficult to reach a place of work. And this is the paradox in their lives that they are more empowered than the previous generation. They have better education. They also have more aspirations. They don't want to be domestic workers. They don't want to be manual laborers. They want to ride the success of the economy. So they want jobs that are in the service economy, that are in the digital economy, but they have structural challenges which have something to do with planning, of course, because if you don't get to work on time, you can be fired. They are in precarious labor. But at the same time, it's also primarily about the fear of entering public spaces, the fear that if I'm late from home, late from work, coming home, number one, I might get sexually assaulted in the bus or in the public spaces. Number two, I might actually, my family might actually engage in violence against me because I have broken the curfew. And many of these women have curfew after 7 o'clock. They have to be home. If they're not, then the family sort of really makes it difficult for them to go out again. So I certainly think it's not just planning. Planning is one of the problems, but it really starts from changing societal ideas about, you know, the position of women and also all other genders in the city and outside the city. And when it comes to the question of smart city, I mean, from my understanding and research on smart cities, what I understand is smart cities is really a bureaucratic, administrative, and management tool of the state in partnership with global corporates. So it's not really trying to resolve a social problem, although it claims to. It's really trying to make the city more efficient. So in the Indian context, you have integrated command and control centers, which sort of monitoring all the streets through the CCTV cameras, issuing traffic violations and doing all of that. But it can only respond because the people who respond to crime are humans and they have their own biases. So if the police is not sensitized to gender issues, the police will not respond in the appropriate way. And some of the work of the NGOs has been to run gender sensitization programs with the police to actually enable them to understand that if the woman is assaulted late at night, it's not what she was wearing and why she was out at 12 o'clock, it's because someone else was violent. So these sorts of issues, I think, is really important. It's also important to have the right policy. So one of the things that we critiqued was the Sustainable Development Goal. And goal 5, which is gender empowerment, has one of the targets and indicators that how many women own a mobile phone is an indicator of empowerment. And one of the critiques was that it's not. You might own a mobile phone, but not know how to use it or know how to use it for your empowerment. Or you might not own a phone, but you might possess it. So most of the women that we saw were actually using their father's or their mother's mobile phone. So officially they were not owning a phone, but they were still using it. But it has constraints in how long and how much they can use it and what for. So leisure time for them in the evening was watching YouTube videos of cooking. But if the phone belongs to your dad, he will take it away from you. So you really don't have any leisure time because you can't go to the city and you can't sit at home and watch YouTube. So there are lots of, it's complex, I think, in brief, is what I would like to say. It's not just one or the other. It's not just planning. It's not just police. It's not just CCTV and surveillance. It's primarily a societal problem of changing ideas of, who is lesser and who is more. And once that is changed, I think policy will be implemented. Right now, it's not because it's people who are implementing. It's mainly men who are implementing these policies. And then planning will improve and transport will become important. Mobility of women will be considered. So I think all of these need to be handled together. You can't just look at one or the other. Thanks. Sorry, I give very long answers.
¿Alguien más?
There's one there.
No, bueno, si no. One more.
Gracias. Bueno, gracias por la exposición. En realidad, hay muchas respuestas que ya se dieron de preguntas que yo tenía, pero hay una que desde el principio pues me causó algunos cuestionamientos y que tiene que ver con las cuestiones sociales y religiosas. Porque yo, hace unas semanas estuve platicando con una persona, no voy a decir el país para no ofender, que ella estaba convencida del rol del hombre y de la mujer, que eran muy específicos. Entonces a mí me parecía una posición muy machista, pese a que ella era una mujer, es una mujer, y defendía ese rol tradicional sumiso de la mujer. Y todas las consecuencias, ¿no? Y a mí me asombraba porque era una mujer, no era mexicana, bueno, es de un país asiático. Y entonces, en India yo desconozco la cultura, bueno, desde luego la literatura, conocemos algo de la India, no he estado en la India como para poder yo afirmar la influencia que puede tener la religión en el comportamiento del hombre, de la mujer y el trato que se tiene, ¿no? Mutuo. Entonces, pues obviamente se acaba de decir que es un problema evidentemente social y yo me cuestionaba si realmente, porque hemos trabajado aquí con el diseño del espacio, con la planeación, para tratar de diseñar espacios más seguros. Entonces, sabemos que no es la solución completa, sino que también está la otra parte del comportamiento, de la conducta, de la cultura, pero la religión no se menciona. Yo no sé si en el caso de la India, porque de pronto uno tiene ideas de que es muy diferente, desde luego, la religión de la India que la que se tiene aquí, aunque no seamos religiosos todos los que estamos aquí o practicantes, pero yo no sé en ese aspecto cuál es el rol de la religión para conseguir el progreso en avanzar en crear espacios seguros, como se decía en un principio, para la mujer.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, so yeah, India is a very diverse country, many religions. The main ones are Hindu, Muslim, Christian, and Sikh. I don't know, I mean, this is going to take me maybe hours to explain, but it's not just religion, it's also caste. And caste and religion also intersect. It doesn't mean that if you're not Hindu, you're not low caste. You can be Muslim and low caste and Christian and low caste. So it's very complex. And we were looking at this, in this project, we were not necessarily focusing specifically on religion or caste. We were looking at young women who come from a variety of backgrounds. And we were looking really at working class and peripheral. So it was geographic and class-based. But having said that, religion does play a role. And I think the example that you gave, that sort of people also exist. Some of the most amount of gender-based violence in the home often happens from mother-in-laws and women to other women. But it's so complex and so diverse, it's hard to say this is how it is. Often you see religion playing a different kind of role in terms of the biases that the lawmakers and the police have towards women. And I don't want to go into the specifics, but often police would be biased sometimes at communities that they don't particularly like. Minority communities sometimes. You could face a higher degree of discrimination if you're lower caste. But again, it depends so much on the context. I mean, cities, you have it less. Peripheries, there may be more of this sort of discrimination. In rural areas, there may be more sort of ghettoization between religions and between upper and lower castes. It's very, very complex. So we can't really say religion is the only thing. I think religion becomes important when the policy is made, when the policy is implemented. That's when you see more religious discrimination. But when you're walking on the roads, they can't tell if you're Hindu or Christian or Muslim. Unless you have the hijab on, then it's easier to tell. But really, I mean, sexual assault cuts across religions, cuts across caste, class, everything. It's just the disadvantage faced by particular religious groups or caste groups or class groups would be different when they go to seek justice. That's when I think the religious bias comes in a bit more. So rather than giving a long lecture, I think in brief, that's how I would see it. It's very, very complex. It's hard to explain quickly.
Okay. Bien, pues como les hemos venido platicando, es un proyecto que tendrá la duración de, ya va arrancado su primer año, otros 4 años más, entonces estarán pues teniendo noticias de los avances. Pues yo quiero agradecerle aquí a la doctora Ayona Datta por su participación y pues quisiera terminar dándole un gran aplauso por su presentación. Gracias.